Fans and analysts are constantly hyping up this supposed heavyweight clash between Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen, but let us be completely honest here, that is not a genuine two-sided rivalry. The harsh reality is that Buffalo's golden boy has absolutely zero postseason victories against number 15, and he has not even sniffed a Super Bowl appearance yet. Now, if you want to talk about genuine bad blood and a true clash of titans, the absolute dogfight between Patrick Mahomes and Joe Burrow was on a completely different level of electricity. Just picture Cincinnati defensive back Mike Hilton hyping up the camera right after dismantling Buffalo in the divisional round, boldly declaring to the world that they were packing their bags for quote Burrowhead. He absolutely disrespected one of the most legendary stadiums in the National Football League, stripping away the Arrowhead moniker and renaming it after his own quarterback. To be fair, they had the receipts to back up that kind of trash talk, considering the Cincinnati Bengals had handed Mahomes 3 consecutive soul-crushing defeats. And the stage was perfectly set for them to stroll right back into the heart of Missouri for yet another high-stakes showdown in the AFC Championship game. They were loud, they were brash, and they made absolutely sure that every single football fan in this country knew they were the big dogs on the block. However, there is a fundamental rule of gridiron survival that they completely ignored. When you relentlessly poke a wounded apex predator, you better be prepared for it to rip your heart out. And if you are loving this breakdown, already smash that like button right now and hit subscribe, because we are just getting started and you do not want to miss a single second of what comes next. To truly grasp the magnitude of this locker room feud, we need to hit the rewind button and look at the absolute mythological status Patrick Mahomes had already achieved, long before Joey Franchise even heard his name called at the draft podium to enter the professional ranks. When he officially grabbed the keys to the Kansas City offense back in 2018, he instantly transformed into a generational anomaly that the sport had not witnessed in decades. The kid casually went out and launched the pigskin for 5,097 passing yards, tossed a mind-boggling 50 touchdowns, and only surrendered 12 interceptions. He absolutely ran away with the most valuable player hardware during his inaugural campaign as the starter, leading the squad to a dominant 12-4 regular season record. Keep in mind, this guy was merely 23 years of age at the time. Those are the kind of video game numbers that nobody has touched since the legendary days of Dan Marino. And if you thought that was a fluke, you are dead wrong, because he kept his foot firmly mashed on the gas pedal. The Chiefs marched deep into the conference title game in 2018, hoisted the Lombardi Trophy in 2019, and punched their ticket right back to the big dance in 2020. As the opening kickoff for the 2021 campaign finally rolled around, the landscape of the league was already set in stone. Number 15 had already cemented a Hall of Fame legacy that 99% of professional quarterbacks can only dream of having over a 20-year span, featuring 2 trips to the Super Bowl. He possessed 1 sparkling championship ring, an esteemed league MVP trophy resting on his mantle, and a massive record-shattering contract extension that crowned him the wealthiest athlete in the history of the sport at that time. He was just 25 years old, and he owned the AFC lock, stock, and barrel, no arguments allowed. Then, strutting out of the tunnel with an unshakable swagger, comes Joseph Lee Burrow. Cincinnati snagged him with the number 1 overall pick in the 2020 draft, after he orchestrated what is widely considered the single most spectacular collegiate season in Louisiana State University history. However, the franchise he inherited was nothing short of an absolute unmitigated dumpster fire. The front office had just suffered through a miserable 2-14 campaign the previous autumn, and their offensive line was practically a revolving door. Honestly, the blocking unit was arguably the most atrocious group in the entire league, and the depth chart was bleeding from gaping roster holes at nearly every single position. To make matters even more tragic, and before the rookie phenom could even wrap up his debut season, he suffered a devastating ACL tear right in the middle of Week 11. Consequently, while the Kansas City superstar was busy kissing silver trophies and piling up an endless mountain of prestigious league honors, the kid from Ohio was grinding through grueling physical therapy sessions just to reconstruct his knee, desperately fighting to prove he was truly built for Sunday gridiron battles. The paths these 2 warriors were walking were essentially on totally opposite ends of the universe. One man was already sitting comfortably on the Iron Throne. Meanwhile, the challenger was fighting tooth and nail just to keep his career alive. Yet, when the autumn of 2021 hit, the Cincinnati squad rolled out looking like a completely revolutionized juggernaut. Coming off that brutal injury, he absolutely torched secondaries for 4,611 passing yards and dropped 34 beautiful touchdown dimes. He finished the marathon season with a stellar passer rating of 108.3 while reuniting with Jamar Chase, his former college weapon, who was snatched up in the first round of that year's draft. That rookie wideout wasted zero time establishing himself as an absolute nightmare for cornerbacks, and arguably the most lethal deep threat in the entire league. The team shocked the world by clinching a 10-6 regular season record, punching their long-awaited ticket back to the postseason for the first time in over half a decade. And suddenly, the national media's entire conversation completely flipped on its head. This guy was dripping with ice-cold swagger, radiating a quiet confidence, and dressing like a fashion icon heading into every single matchup. He strutted around the facility with the undeniable aura of a veteran who already knew he was elite. He never had to scream for attention because his alpha dog body language spoke volumes. Joe Shiesty was rapidly evolving into something way bigger than just a guy calling plays in the huddle. He was transforming into a bona fide cultural icon. Then, the calendar flipped to January 2nd, 2022, when the mighty Chiefs took a road trip out to the jungle in Week 17. Kansas City rolled into town having already secured the coveted #1 playoff seed in the conference, which meant the pressure levels were vastly mismatched between the two sidelines. However, the kid in stripes refused to treat the afternoon like some throwaway exhibition match. He went absolute scorched earth, airing it out for 446 yards and 4 massive passing touchdowns, while his favorite target racked up an insane 266 receiving yards and hauled in a trio of scores. That epic performance featured a downright miraculous conversion on an unbelievable 3rd and 27 situation that pretty much slammed the door shut on any hopes of a Kansas City comeback. When the final whistle blew, the boys in orange walked away with a monumental statement victory, edging out the reigning Kings 34-31. To see anyone completely dismantle a powerhouse like that was basically unheard of across the entire NFL, but pulling off a win during the regular season is a completely different beast than the postseason grind. Exactly 21 days after that initial clash, Cincinnati was packing their bags for the absolute loudest, most intimidating venue in professional football, Arrowhead Stadium, to fight for the AFC title. And the league's golden boy was standing right there at the gates, absolutely starving for some payback. This highly anticipated showdown went down on January 30th, 2022, on that freezing Kansas City turf. Vegas odds makers basically laughed at Cincinnati, slapping them with a massive 7-point disadvantage, and honestly, unless you lived in Southern Ohio, you assumed this squad was just walking straight into a slaughterhouse. Before this particular clash, the Kansas City signal caller boasted a stellar 2-1 track record in conference title fights. His only blemish on that stage came at the hands of Tom Brady himself, the undisputed greatest to ever lace up a pair of cleats. Trying to knock this guy out in his own backyard during the playoffs felt practically impossible, and his squad looked downright invincible. Throughout the opening 2 quarters, the script played out exactly like all the talking heads predicted. The home team stormed out of the locker room and absolutely curb-stomped the visitors right from the opening kickoff. Their superstar quarterback quickly connected with the cheetah for a lightning-fast trip to the end zone, completely tearing up the secondary before lobbing additional scoring strikes to his favorite tight end Travis Kelce and speedy wideout Mecole Hardman. By the time the referees blew the whistle for intermission, the reigning powerhouse had constructed a suffocating 21-3 advantage. At that exact moment, the boys in stripes looked exactly like the inexperienced, overhyped roster everyone accused them of being a Cinderella story that had miraculously stumbled way out of their depth in the brutal playoff picture. However, this is exactly the moment where the entire narrative flipped absolutely upside down, and the real chaos began. The final 30 minutes felt like we were watching an entirely alternate reality. Cincinnati marched back out onto the frozen grass and suddenly started chewing up massive chunks of yardage with zero hesitation. Joe Cool somehow managed to thread a gorgeous 41-yard bomb directly into the hands of Samaj Perrine, taking it to the house and shrinking the massive deficit down to 21-10. Shortly after, his dynamic rookie target Jamar Chase snatched a spectacular grab right at the goal line for a 2-yard strike, deadlocking the scoreboard at 21 apiece. The momentum completely shifted when rookie kicker Evan McPherson casually drilled a massive 52-yard rocket straight through the uprights, giving the underdogs a 24-21 edge with a little more than 6 minutes left on the clock. That deafening, chaotic sea of red that had been screaming their lungs out for hours suddenly dropped into absolute haunting silence. The ball was back in the hands of the Kansas City superstar with plenty of time to orchestrate a legendary game-winning march, and unsurprisingly, he systematically carved up the secondary to get right inside kicking distance, setting up Harrison Butker to blast a clutch kick that leveled the battlefield at 24, right as the final buzzer sounded. Once the coin flipped for the sudden death extra period, things got incredibly dicey. Kansas City won the toss, meaning their golden boy took the field first, and absolutely everybody watching assumed the ending was inevitable. He was going to march down, punch it in, and send the visitors packing. Except, in a truly shocking twist of fate, the superstar gunslinger launched a terribly ill-advised pass that landed right into the hands of the defense. With the ball back in Cincinnati's possession and the entire stadium holding its collective breath, their franchise quarterback surgically carved through the defense, positioning McPherson for a 31-yard gut punch that sealed the legendary upset 27-24. A guy playing in only his second professional season had just marched straight into the hostile territory of the league's biggest icon, erasing a catastrophic 18-point deficit to steal the conference crown. That underlying chatter simmering under the radar for months finally detonated into explosive headline news across the sports world by the time the sun came up. Joey Franchise proved he was not just an above-average starter. This kid was a completely different breed of competitor entirely. He established himself as the rare type of field general who could fearlessly strut into one of the most hostile environments in sports and snatch the soul from the home team during the final 2 quarters when the pressure was capable of crushing diamonds. However, we really need to pause and look at the gritty behind-the-scenes reality of what actually unfolded on that turf. The Kansas City Titan concluded the afternoon throwing for 275 yards, securing 3 trips to the end zone, but coughing up a pair of brutal picks. Furthermore, the defense managed to drag him to the dirt for 4 massive sacks while battering him relentlessly on almost every single drop back. The massive guys protecting the pocket for the home team completely fell apart as the game dragged on into the later stages, forcing their typically flawless quarterback to panic and heave desperate, dangerous passes while running for his absolute life in a completely uncharacteristic meltdown. You have to give massive respect to the guys stopping the ball for Ohio. This monumental victory was absolutely not just a simple case of one quarterback vastly outshining the other. It was an incredible full roster effort, where every single guy wearing stripes dug deep and delivered right when their backs were pressed firmly against the wall. Nevertheless, the spin zone that the national sports television networks decided to push to the masses was incredibly black and white. The headline screamed that the new kid on the block had officially conquered the king, insisting Cincinnati now held the deed to Kansas City, and frankly, looking at the scoreboard, it was incredibly hard to argue against that spicy angle. At the end of the day, a massive legacy-defining victory is exactly what the record books are going to show forever. The underdog squad eventually punched their ticket to the ultimate championship stage, though they suffered a heartbreaking defeat to Los Angeles after Matthew Stafford orchestrated a devastating final-minute march. It was a bitter pill to swallow, yet their path forward appeared absolutely dripping with limitless potential. Their franchise savior was merely 25 years old, and his dynamic partner in crime was just a fresh-faced first-year player who had miraculously racked up a staggering 1,455 receiving yards. It was incredibly obvious to every executive in the league that this Ohio franchise was assembling an absolute juggernaut destined to terrorize the conference for a very long time. Sure enough, once the 2022 campaign finally kicked off, they completely silenced any remaining doubters by proving the monumental hype was absolutely real. They wrapped up their schedule with a phenomenal 12-4 win-loss record. Their star slinger absolutely torched secondaries, racking up 4,475 passing yards and 35 scoring strikes, while only surrendering the ball 12 times total. That attacking unit transformed into an absolute nightmare for defensive coordinators across the nation, especially as T. Higgins leveled up his game to become a terrifyingly lethal secondary threat right beside their primary superstar. Cincinnati possessed an incredibly deep roster, an unmistakable swagger, and a genuinely unshakable conviction in their own greatness. As training camps opened for the 2022 campaign, analysts completely stopped wondering if the boys in stripes were capable of hanging with the reigning kings of the conference. Instead, the entire football world was busy asking a vastly different question, wondering if the mighty Chiefs could somehow find a way to keep pace with Cincinnati. It was absolutely mind-blowing to witness just how drastically the balance of power had flipped upside down over the course of a mere 24 months. And this feeling was heavily amplified by the completely chaotic roster-gutting offseason that Kansas City had just endured. Blockbuster reports broke the internet, announcing that superstar wideout Tyreek Hill was officially shipped out of the Midwest and sent down to South Beach. With massive foundational pieces suddenly gone, pundits and fans alike were completely in the dark about how this squad would function while relying heavily on a fresh crop of untested first-year players. Yet the franchise cornerstone under center did not sweat the massive overhaul for a single second. Patrick Mahomes silenced all his doubters by orchestrating an absolutely legendary 2022 run that cemented his legacy even further. He casually dropped 5,250 passing yards, tossed 41 touchdowns, secured first-team All-Pro honors, snatched up another MVP trophy, and dragged his squad to a dominant 14-3 finish. When you looked at the raw data and sheer talent on both sidelines, it honestly felt like watching two absolute juggernauts barreling straight toward a catastrophic collision. Their paths finally crossed once more during Week 13, and the brutal outcome merely reinforced the exact same narrative that the national media had been pushing all year. The only real difference was that Cincinnati's locker room suddenly possessed an even bigger megaphone to broadcast their absolute dominance to the entire globe. I distinctly recall kicking back on December 4th, 2022, which coincidentally happens to be my birthday, catching this heavyweight bout at my absolute favorite burger joint. Major props to that establishment, by the way. Going into the matchup, I genuinely believe the boys from Missouri were finally prepared to exercise their demons. Cincinnati welcomed their bitter rivals into the deafening hostile environment of Paycor Stadium for a brutal late-season showdown. Even though January football was still weeks away, the sheer electric tension in the freezing air made it feel like a terrifying winner-go-home postseason dogfight. Whenever these two juggernauts clashed on the gridiron, the entire league held its breath because the bad blood and recent heartbreaks were simply too raw to ignore. The implications were crystal clear to absolutely everyone watching, as the eventual victor would secure massive psychological warfare rights and a permanent mental edge for the remainder of the brutal campaign. Joe was absolutely dialed into the Matrix from the moment the very first whistle blew, operating with utterly terrifying precision. He completely shredded the secondary, connecting on 25 of his 31 attempts for a staggering 286 yards through the air and a pair of beautiful touchdowns. Boasting a completion rate well above 80% and a jaw-dropping passer rating of 126.6, he surrendered 0 turnovers and displayed absolute ice-cold patience as he engineered a flawless surgical dismantling of the toughest defensive fronts the opposition could possibly throw his way. When the clock hit 0, the scoreboard read 27-24 in favor of the home team, marking their third consecutive victory over the reigning superstar quarterback. 3 back-to-back agonizing defeats. That haunting statistic echoed loudly throughout the entire football landscape. 3 separate occasions where the generational talent from Texas Tech squared off against number 9, only to walk off the turf completely empty-handed and utterly defeated. For an undisputed offensive wizard who had basically spent the last 4 years treating the entire AFC like his own personal playground, hitting a roadblock like this was profoundly shocking. Literally nobody else in the entire league had managed to pull off anything remotely close to this level of mastery. The formidable squad from Baltimore could not do it. The heavyweight contenders in Buffalo repeatedly fell short. Yet this gritty squad from Ohio, originally viewed as complete afterthoughts and massive underdogs, had done it 3 straight times. And by every single metric you could possibly look at, that they were the undisputed landlords of this bitter rivalry. Sports networks across the country swallowed the storyline hook, line, and sinker. aggressively broadcasting the undeniable fact that this cool-headed gunslinger was the only true kryptonite to the league's golden boy. Analysts boldly declared that the defensive coordinators in Ohio had completely cracked the ultimate code, officially crowning them as the absolute supreme final boss of the conference. Period. End of discussion. And to be completely fair to the massive hype train, it was incredibly easy to understand why the entire world was drawing those exact conclusions. The cold hard proof was staring everyone directly in the face. 3 massive showdowns produced 3 identical gut-wrenching results favoring the exact same locker room. The film room analysis brilliantly supported every single piece of the hype. But there was a much deeper, far more terrifying reality brewing just beneath the surface of the headlines. This specific roster had authentically evolved into an absolute powerhouse, easily ranking among the most lethal and complete organizations in the entire sport. They absolutely were not coasting by unlucky breaks, bizarre trick plays, or fluky situational football tactics. Their franchise leader was operating in an untouchable god-tier rhythm, while their high-octane offensive weapons were an absolute nightmare to defend. Meanwhile, their defensive unit had transformed into a relentless brick wall, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that this entire depth chart was overflowing with authentic championship-caliber DNA. Furthermore, they were fueled by the massive psychological boost of having conquered the sport's biggest giant 3 consecutive times, breeding a deadly strain of confidence that was not just cheap arrogance, it was hard-earned and completely justified. Here is a question for all of you in the comments, and I genuinely want to hear your take on this. Do you believe Joe Burrow still has what it takes to win a Super Bowl? Or has that championship window officially closed in Cincinnati? Drop your answer below, let the debate begin. At this exact junction in time, the superstar quarterback's legendary off-the-field image had completely cemented itself into modern pop culture, defined by flashy designer fur coats, indoor shades, and an aura of absolutely effortless ice-cold swagger. Fans and the internet collectively bestowed upon him the brilliantly fitting freezing nickname of Joe Burrow, and it genuinely encapsulated his entire persona to absolute perfection. He never needed to resort to cheap trash talk behind a microphone, because his quiet, terrifyingly confident energy loudly spoke volumes on its own. We were watching a fiercely determined warrior who had fundamentally convinced himself that he was the absolute greatest signal caller in the entire AFC, and he violently backed up that massive claim on the gridiron every single Sunday without fail. That unbreakable arrogance you saw on camera, it was absolutely not an act. That was his genuine, authentic DNA, and that exact same fearless energy infected every single guy sitting inside that locker room. Look, whenever a squad manages to take down the undisputed kings of the conference 3 consecutive times, your entire organizational posture completely transforms. Suddenly, the boys wearing the black and orange stripes truly bought into the idea that they were the ultimate benchmark of greatness. They completely stopped viewing themselves as scrappy underdogs or a fun up-and-coming franchise. They saw themselves as the definitive kings of the mountain. You absolutely have to keep that psychological shift in mind if you want to make any sense of the absolute circus that went down next. Because the exact moment Mike Hilton stepped off the turf following that freezing clash against Buffalo and dropped his infamous soundbite, it was not just some random trash talk. That flex originated from a roster that had completely figured out the league's golden child, and they were marching right back into enemy territory for the AFC title clash with a rock-solid conviction that they were vastly superior. The fatal flaw, however, was how they chose to broadcast that massive ego to the entire planet. You see, there is a monumental gap between quietly trusting your game plan and openly disrespecting a rabid sports city by claiming you hold the deed to their historic building. The former is just standard competitive grit, while the latter is the ultimate form of locker room bulletin board ammunition. And believe me, you're the defending champ sitting in the Midwest possessed an incredibly long and bitter memory. Cincinnati absolutely demolished Buffalo 27-10 during the divisional playoff weekend, and honestly, the scoreboard made it look way closer than the actual bloodbath on the field. The visitors dictated the physical tempo from the opening kickoff to the final whistle, with their relentless pass rush forcing the opposing quarterback into panicked erratic decisions all afternoon long. It served as a massive shot across the bow, delivering the exact type of flawless execution that forces every single general manager across the NFL to sit up and take serious notes. But then, instead of celebrating quietly, the veteran cornerback hunted down the nearest television crew for his post-game spotlight. He dropped the legendary mic drop line, declaring they would see everyone at Burrowhead. That was the exact phrase that sparked the fire. It was punchy, deeply disrespectful, and fired like a heat-seeking missile directly at the heart of Chiefs Kingdom. He completely erased the legendary name of the fortress they had defended since 1972 by rebranding it. What the underlying message was loud and completely impossible to miss. He essentially told millions of viewers that the historic grounds were no longer the property of the home team. They were legally owned by their ice-cold franchise quarterback and the entire state of Ohio. Look, if we are playing devil's advocate here and giving the guy some grace, that locker room had absolutely put in the grueling work required to walk around with their chests puffed out. They had historically dominated the league's most valuable player 3 separate times, including ripping his heart out in that very same building to win the conference crown just 12 months prior. This was not some delusional fake bravado cooked up to generate empty hype. It was forged from hard-hitting, undeniably factual evidence laid out on the gridiron. However, smart football minds know there is a healthy kind of arrogance, the quiet kind that drives your film study and keeps your entire squad laser focused on the prize. Then, you cross a massive dangerous line when you decide to hijack primetime television just to publicly slap your quarterback's name onto a rival's legendary cathedral. Those two approaches reside in completely different solar systems when it comes to locker room etiquette. And the wild part is, it was not just the players running their mouths. Even local politicians threw themselves into the circus, releasing official videos to mock the opponent right before kickoff. The local sports radio stations were absolutely buzzing, and the die-hard faithful traveling with the team cranked up the toxic energy to an 11. Suddenly, the entire national media cycle leading up to the final showdown before the Super Bowl became entirely anchored to this massive storyline that the Road Warriors were simply going to stroll back into that hostile Midwestern environment and repeat history on a silver platter. The expectation was to kick the front doors in, disrespect the hosts, and fly home with another shiny trophy. But folks completely forgot one terrifying reality about number 15. That dude operates at a psychotic level of greatness and never requires outside noise to get his blood pumping. He hits the tunnel every single Sunday morning equipped with a ruthless, cold-blooded obsession to completely dismantle whoever is standing across from him. But if you genuinely want to do something incredibly stupid and guarantee that he plays like a man possessed right out of the gate, jumping on a hot microphone to inform the universe that his sacred turf has been conquered and renamed is practically begging for a massacre. The superstar tight end definitely caught wind of the disrespect, and you better believe every single dude lifting weights in that complex had the clip playing on loop. And the reigning juggernauts who were still nursing the fresh scars from getting booted out of the postseason bracket by those very same loudmouths a year earlier were absolutely not interested in turning the other cheek. If you study the history of American sports, you will notice a terrifying trend when dealing with dynastic franchises. They slowly brew a deep-seated organizational fury the second any new kid on the block dares to question their royal status in the public square. Tom Brady and his crew wielded that exact same deadly chip on their shoulder for 20 solid years of absolute terror. Now it was this new regime, a squad that had effortlessly ruled the conference with an iron fist for 4 consecutive seasons, long before the new guy from Ohio ever took his first snap. Kansas City had already punched their ticket to the Super Bowl twice during that absolute tear, ultimately taking home the Lombardi Trophy once. Add to that the staggering fact that Patrick Mahomes had literally never dropped consecutive postseason matchups in his entire professional career. But suddenly, they found themselves staring down a gritty squad that had handed them 3 agonizing defeats in a row. And to make matters worse, this upstart roster was openly disrespecting their legendary home turf, completely renaming it on national television just to rub salt in the wound. To be fair, Cincinnati absolutely possessed the hardware and the scoreboard receipts to justify their massive egos, but the truth was the guys in red and gold were not shaking in their cleats at all. Instead, they were harboring a deep, simmering hatred for the visitors from Ohio. Let me tell you, a locker room fueled by pure spite creates a significantly deadlier football team compared to a squad that just rolls out of the tunnel assuming they will cruise to an easy victory. The stage was officially locked in for the 2022 AFC Championship Showdown. It was the Bengals invading Arrowhead Stadium on January 29, 2023, and basically every single football fanatic across the globe was glued to their screens. Cincinnati stepped off the plane, riding an undeniable high, armed with a 3-game winning streak against the league's golden boy and a wildly rabid fan base backing their every move. They even brought along that catchy, highly inflammatory new nickname for the very venue they were about to step foot inside. Meanwhile, the hometown crew brought an entirely different vibe to the table, radiating a terrifyingly silent intensity that felt exactly like the eerie stillness right before a massive hurricane makes landfall. Game day finally arrived on January 29, 2023, taking place at the iconic Arrowhead Stadium, or Burrowhead, if you happen to be asking anyone draped in orange and black. The visiting squad burst out of the locker room absolutely dripping with swagger, fueled by every single piece of bulletin board material and trash talk we just covered. The boys from the Queen City were genuinely convinced that this high-stakes matchup was destined to follow the exact same script as their previous 3 monumental victories. However, the moment the pigskin was snapped, it was painstakingly obvious that the home defense had tapped into an entirely new savage level of aggression. Their star quarterback was not trying to pull off magic tricks or wild circus plays out of the gate. Instead, he was executing his playbook with the cold, calculated precision of a seasoned sniper. The guys in red completely dictated the rhythm of the football game right from the opening whistle. They marched down the turf with surgical efficiency, forcing Joe Burrow and his explosive weapons to sit down and freeze on the bench, while the massive guys in the trenches up front started doing serious work. That specific group of blockers, who had honestly been a massive glaring weakness against the visiting team's relentless pass rush in the past, stood their ground beautifully and totally flipped the script from the previous season. Thanks to that brick wall of protection, number 15 actually had the luxury of planting his feet and thoroughly scanning the entire gridiron to find his open targets. He was no longer sprinting for his life just to avoid eating turf. He was standing tall and dissecting the secondary like a master tactician. The visitors somehow managed to stay within striking distance, which is truly the most accurate way to frame their performance during those brutal middle quarters. To their credit, the road team absolutely refused to get blown off the field, and their icy vein signal caller definitely managed to pull off a handful of miraculous throws. His go-to star wideout certainly did his part as well, coming up unbelievably clutch when they decided to roll the dice on a few massive do-or-die conversion attempts, allowing their unit to find temporary bursts of momentum. Yet, that undeniable cocky aura that had practically been the team's trademark for the entire campaign, that incredibly relaxed, unshakable feeling of absolute certainty that they owned the building, simply vanished into thin air compared to what we all witnessed during their dominant regular season run. The hometown defense was flying around the grass with terrifying speed, swarming the ball carrier on every single down. Their cornerbacks practically glued themselves to the receivers, and the defensive line brought a level of sheer brutal physicality that completely caught their bitter rivals off guard. It was painfully obvious that the coaching staff had spent countless hours obsessing over the game film from those 3 heartbreaking defeats, tweaking their master plan to absolute perfection. The legendary quarterback wrapped up the evening tossing for a massive 326 yards through the air, punching in 2 crucial touchdowns, and remarkably keeping the football entirely out of the defense's hands. Furthermore, he masterfully orchestrated a pair of agonizingly long sustained marches down the field during the latter half of the contest, aggressively draining the play clock and forcing the opposing offense to sit helplessly on the sidelines. But listen to this, because here is where things get truly chaotic. The wild closing moments of this absolute slugfest will undoubtedly spark screaming matches in Ohio sports bars for the next 50 years. The scoreboard was deadlocked at 20-20 deep into the final quarter of play, and with a golden opportunity to break the tie and steal the victory, the ball was placed right back in the hands of the reigning MVP. The offensive unit had relentlessly clawed their way right up to the very edge of enemy territory, desperately trying to get into kicking range. And then, in a split second that would forever echo in modern football history, disaster struck. The hobbled quarterback tucked the ball and desperately scrambled toward the white paint, but just as he crossed over the chalk to safety, a defender absolutely blasted him, sending yellow laundry flying onto the turf immediately. They flagged him for unnecessary roughness after the play was completely dead, a devastating 15-yard blunder that gifted the home team an automatic first down, and essentially served up a chip shot attempt for Harrison Butker on a silver platter. The visiting crowd absolutely lost their minds, screaming that the game was rigged, as sports media instantly blew up debating the fairness of the penalty flag. However, when you step back, take off the fan goggles, and watch the slow motion HD replay with a clear head today, the truth is pretty unavoidable. It was just a remarkably foolish decision by the defender. The quarterback was literally a full 3 strides deep into the sideline bench area before he got forcefully shoved to the ground. The entire visiting sideline exploded in a furious meltdown of pure disbelief and absolute heartbreak. Regardless of the screaming, the officials held their ground. The march downfield concluded, and their clutch specialist casually booted the game-sealing 3-pointer directly through the uprights. The devastated road squad got the pigskin back with a measly 3 seconds left on the stadium clock, sealing their fate as Kansas City walked away with a massive 23-20 ultimate triumph. Cincinnati did not simply drop a football game, they wrote checks with their mouths all week long that their play on the gridiron absolutely could not cash. Swallowing a pill like that is a tough break, especially considering there were undeniable moments throughout the contest where the Bengals genuinely looked like the superior squad on the turf. Their star quarterback had his fair share of golden chances to put the nail in the coffin, yet the offense stumbled when it mattered most. But hey, that is the harsh reality of the National Football League. Patrick Mahomes, showing his typical clutch gene, marched Kansas City right down the field to a spot where a single play could seal the deal. At the end of the day, that is exactly the kind of magic you expect from a generational signal caller. The truly great ones simply refuse to lose, dragging their squads across the finish line by sheer force of will. Once the clock hit 0 and the confetti started falling, a fired-up Travis Kelce snatched the mic right in the middle of the post-game chaos to send a very specific message. He took direct aim at the politician running the city of Cincinnati, a guy who had spent the entire lead-up to the matchup running his mouth on social media. Going full professional wrestling mode, the star tight end bluntly told the mayor to recognize his proper place and keep his lips tightly zipped. He hurled insults that echoed through the stadium, dropping a legendary unfiltered soundbite that hit the absolute bullseye and fired up the entire fan base. The guys in stripes strutted into Arrowhead with an unbelievable amount of swagger and smack talk, but it was the home team that actually hoisted the Lamar Hunt hardware. Number 15 silenced the doubters with his arm and his legs, while his favorite receiving target took care of the verbal knockout punches during the trophy presentation. The payback tour was officially wrapped up in a neat little bow, though the bigger picture, the overarching narrative that would completely reshape the destiny of these two organizations for the foreseeable future, was merely kicking off. You see, the massive fallout from that epic conference championship clash did a whole lot more than just put a temporary pin in a bitter feud. It acted as a massive fork in the road, sending these two powerhouse rosters down wildly contrasting paths. In the wake of that monumental postseason showdown, the trajectories of both clubs violently diverged, creating a massive canyon of success between them that continues to expand with every passing season. The guys in red and gold embarked on an absolute tear that has not been witnessed by modern gridiron fans since the salary cap era began. Kansas City hoisted the Lombardi Trophy to cap off the 2022 campaign, then turned right around and repeated the feat in 2023, securing consecutive rings and making it 3 world championships in a staggering 5-year span. They firmly cemented themselves as the unquestioned juggernaut of the 2020s, becoming the ultimate gold standard that all 31 other front offices desperately try to emulate. Their superstar quarterback has racked up a trio of Super Bowl MVP awards on the biggest stage imaginable, alongside a pair of regular season hardware awards and a postseason win-loss record that practically forces analysts to debate his status among the Mount Rushmore of legendary passers. If you take a step back and examine the sheer volume of accolades he compiled before even hitting his 30th birthday, claiming he sits comfortably inside the top 3 players to ever touch a pigskin is not some wild hot take anymore. It is just objective reality at this point. Meanwhile, the brilliant brain trust operating behind the scenes in Missouri never took their foot off the gas when it came to surrounding their guy with top-tier talent. Head coach Andy Reid continued cooking up absolute masterclasses in the playbook, while the scouting department ruthlessly plucked perfect puzzle pieces from the draft and free agency. Their Hall of Fame tight end remained the ultimate safety blanket, and anytime a speedy wideout departed, a fresh playmaker stepped into the spotlight, proving this front office did not merely stumble blindly into a generational talent. They constructed a bulletproof machine designed to squeeze every single ounce of potential out of their superstar captain, season after grueling season. That level of elite consistency is exactly what draws the line between a fun roster that makes a deep run and an immortal history-making empire. Solid squads rely on a couple of superstars to bail them out, whereas true dynasties build unshakable foundations that breed perpetual winning, which brings us to the absolute tragedy unfolding in Ohio. Believe it or not, the guys in the Tiger Stripes have completely failed to punch a ticket to the postseason since that heartbreaking defeat. They have been shut out of the dance entirely. That supposedly wide-open championship window back in January of 2023, featuring a prime 26-year-old gunslinger under center, hungry to capture that elusive ring and cement his early legacy, while T. Higgins was transforming into an absolutely lethal top-tier co-star on the perimeter. Well, that window slammed completely shut much faster than anyone in the sports media landscape predicted. Disaster struck when their franchise cornerstone suffered a devastating wrist injury in November of 2023, forcing him to watch the remainder of that campaign from the sidelines. He bounced back with a vengeance during the 2024 stretch, putting up mind-blowing award-worthy numbers: 4,918 passing yards, 43 strikes to the end zone, and a blistering 108.5 passer rating. Not to mention, he easily secured his second trip to the league's annual Pro Bowl festivities. Yet, despite his absolute heroics on the gridiron, the squad sputtered out with a painfully mediocre 9-8 record, leaving them sitting on the couch for January football. Fast forward to 2025, and a nagging turf toe issue benched him for a massive chunk of the schedule, causing the entire organization's hopes to completely derail before the leaves even started changing colors. But pointing the finger solely at the medical tent is an easy way out that ignores the massive structural flaws lurking behind the scenes. Ownership decided to pinch pennies when it came to protecting their multi-million-dollar investment, repeatedly rolling out a bargain bin offensive line. It is the exact same catastrophic blocking unit that allowed their star to get brutally battered during his rookie days, proving the front office never actually committed to building a reliable wall in the trenches. That elite locker room of weapons and blockers they handed him back in 2021 and 2022, management completely dropped the ball on ever getting that magic back. Sure, the front office finally backed up the money truck to keep Jamar Chase in town, and T. Higgins stuck around after a seriously ugly drawn-out standoff over his paycheck. But the essential roster depth, the locker room brotherhood, and the ruthless organizational drive to build a bulletproof 53-man roster around a generational quarterback just vanished. It never materialized the way it absolutely needed to. Look across the sideline, and the difference between these two front offices is absolutely mind-blowing. Patrick operates inside an empire where the general manager attacks every single spring like hoisting the Lombardi trophy is life or death, knowing full well the championship window is wide open. Meanwhile, Joey Franchise has spent the last 36 months grinding through the mud, fighting, devastating physical wear and tear, along with baffling front office moves that made his job 100 times harder than it ever had to be. Do not get it twisted, the kid remains an absolute elite gunslinger and a top-tier field general in this league. But possessing a cannon for an arm means absolutely nothing when the executives upstairs refuse to match your competitive fire and championship standard. Cincinnati literally lived in Kansas City's head, rent-free for a minute there, acting like they held the ultimate cheat code against the league's most lethal weapon. They completely owned the narrative, and they owned the stadium they cockily renamed Burrowhead before fumbling the bag completely. It was not some massive sudden implosion on the field, but rather a slow, silent bleed out behind the scenes. It was a death by 1,000 paper cuts, driven by cheap front office choices that just piled up year after year. One organization aggressively cemented a historic football dynasty, while the other sat on their hands and watched their golden championship window slam shut in their faces. Honestly, the absolute peak of the Cincinnati era happened the exact second they grabbed the microphones and started talking reckless smack to the press. Number 15 never bothered firing back with cheap sound bites. He took his revenge straight to the gridiron, clapping back with 3 consecutive trips to the big game and slipping 2 more massive championship rings onto his fingers. When the dust settles on the field, that is the only kind of trash talk that actually echoes into eternity. The game tape does not lie. When a front office gets arrogant, the ultimate price is spending every single February watching your greatest rival parade through a shower of confetti. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, you already know what to do. Smash that like button, hit subscribe, and ring that notification bell so you never miss a single breakdown. We drop nothing but elite content right here, and trust me, you do not want to sleep on what is coming next.